Slave Quarters in Cyprus, October 1862.
The scream came quick, wet, sharp, and final. It echoed once through the cane, then vanished into the Florida night, and just as quickly came another. Then silence. Then the sound of something tearing. The fields at Cypress Quarters were heavy with August heat, but down in the rows it felt cold, like the ground itself had frozen in shock. 4 white men lay sprawled across the dirt, their eyes open, mouths slack. One had a slit across his throat so deep it almost decapitated him. Another had his belly carved open, steam rising from his torn flesh in the night air. A third had a blade still lodged in his gut. The last, the cruelest of them, had his face caved in with a hammer, his hand still twitching near his holstered pistol. They weren't ambushed, they were executed. No alarms, no shouting, no warning shots, just blood. Lots of it, and it soaked into the same soil black hands had been forced to work for generations. This wasn't an uprising. It was retribution. Imagine it, standing there barefoot, heart thudding in your throat, the sweet smell of cane mixing with the sharp sting of blood and sweat. You hear the breath leave a man's lungs. You feel the earth shake beneath your knees, and you realize you're not afraid, you're ready. 12 slaves vanished into the darkness that night, not scattered, not frantic. They moved as one, precise, like they'd done this 1,000 times in their minds before ever lifting a blade. Near the edge of the pines, someone dropped a pouch, brown leather, blood-stained, with 2 letters carved deep into the flap. MS, it wasn't a message, it was a mark. They didn't leave bodies to send a signal. They left them because it was the only language the overseers understood. These weren't rebels born in rage. They were men and women forged in silence. They had buried their grief in the cane for years. Now it rose back up, carved into muscle, bone, and fury. And when it came for the overseers, it didn't come screaming. It came quiet. Too quiet to stop. So who planned this? Who mapped every move, counted every shift, timed every strike to the second? And what finally broke inside them? That mercy was no longer an option. The answer wasn't in the blood-soaked fields. It was in the days before, in the whispers, in the betrayals, in the lies that lit the fuse, and in the firestorm they left behind. What happened at Cypress Quarters didn't start at midnight. It started long before, and the worst was still to come. At sunrise, Cypress Quarters looked like paradise. The house stood tall on its hill, white as bone and trimmed with green shutters that caught the early light just right. Fresh biscuits steamed on porcelain plates. The aroma of tobacco, sugar, syrup, and coffee drifted from the kitchen. Wind stirred the magnolias, and from the second-floor balcony, Overseer Rutledge sipped bourbon like it was water, laughing about a good night's work. He didn't know 4 of his kind were lying dead in the cane fields below. Not yet. Inside the parlor, card games dragged on from the night before. Muddy boots rested on Persian rugs. A fiddle sat propped in the corner, strings still humming from the last dance. Cane profits were up. The war was far away. And for the men who ran Cyprus, life was predictable. Just another morning after another night of bourbon, bets, and black labor. But just beyond the oaks, down a sloped trail of churned earth and trampled moss, the plantation changed. Wooden cabins lined up like graves, their roofs sagging, their doors hanging open on rusted hinges. Chickens pecked through trash. Smoke rose from a single pit where 3 women stirred thin gruel into a cracked pot. Children with hollow eyes dragged sticks through the dirt. The air here didn't smell like sugar. It smelled like sweat, ash, mildew, and waste. Inside one of those cabins, a girl barely 12 held her baby brother against her chest while her mother pressed cloth to her split lip. Across the room, a man sat silent, blood drying across his back in thin lines from the night before. He hadn't made a sound during the whipping. He hadn't moved since. There were no windows, No light. Just flickers from a candle stub set in a beer bottle. Imagine watching this unfold with your own eyes. The main house has silk drapes and iced tea. But here, just a few dozen steps away, there are rats in the grain and children coughing blood. You hear laughter from the porch while a man fights to breathe in the shadows. Two worlds, one land. Rutledge used to joke that the slaves were lucky. Better than the swamps, he'd say. They've got food and work, a roof, structure. But his idea of structure was chains. He kept a punishment book. Every lash recorded. Every escape attempt tallied. He liked order. He liked obedience, and he liked breaking the ones who resisted. Last winter, a boy named Henry had tried to run. Rutledge caught him after 3 days. What came next was done in front of the entire quarter. No one ever said exactly what happened, but after that day, the boy never spoke again. The message was clear. You don't run from Cypress, and you don't fight. But something had shifted. Somehow, overnight, the silence that Rutledge had relied on had cracked. A plan had been growing. Not in the open, but beneath it, in glances, in hidden carvings beneath bunks, in songs that sounded like spirituals, but meant something else entirely. Because those cabins weren't just cages. They were classrooms, and someone was teaching survival in a language that overseers couldn't hear. The bodies in the field were proof of that. Someone had been learning how to fight back, carefully, quietly. And now the masters were waking up to the first lesson. 4 of their own, gutted in the night. 12 missing slaves, no footprints, no witnesses. Just fear, for the first time in years, rising up like smoke over their perfect little empire. What would happen if the rest of the quarters found out? What if others were waiting to do the same? And most of all, who had lit the match? The house was still asleep. But the fire was spreading, and the line between master and prey had already started to blur. 1 year before the blood hit the cane, there was a deal. Not written on paper, not signed with ink, but whispered in the stable yard by a man who always smiled when he lied. Overseer Rutledge had gathered 3 young slaves, Cato, Elijah, and Moses. They were strong, fast, and loyal. Or so he thought. He had a problem. Another slave, older, had escaped. A man named Abram, sharp-minded, quiet, a threat. Rutledge couldn't find him. The dogs had lost the trail, so he made an offer. Bring him back, Rutledge told them, and by next summer, your names will be off the books. You'll be free. It was bait, and it worked. Cato believed him the moment he heard it. Elijah didn't, not fully, but followed his friend anyway. And Moses didn't speak at all. He just stared, calculating. They tracked Abram for 4 days through the swamp, found him hiding under an overturned canoe near an abandoned mill. He was sick, thin, and he didn't fight. Cato cried on the way back. Elijah carried Abram over his shoulder like a brother, but Rutledge didn't even thank them. The next morning, Abram was hanged right in front of the quarters. No trial, no prayer, just a rope, a tree, and a warning. And the boys, they didn't get freedom, they got punishment. Cato's fingers were shattered with a mallet. Elijah was whipped until he passed out, lashes carved into him like tally marks. And Moses was chained and sent to the swamp gang, a labor unit so brutal most never returned. But Moses did. 6 months later, he walked back onto Cypress like a shadow, skin darker from the sun, eyes colder. He never smiled, he never limped. And he never forgot. He didn't speak to Rutledge, he didn't speak to anyone, he just started watching every routine, every shortcut, every bottle the overseers emptied, every key on every ring. He watched and listened, and in the evenings, he'd kneel in the dirt behind his cabin and carve little notches into a flat piece of wood. Nobody asked what they meant, not at first. But Elijah knew. And Cato, though his fingers never healed, still had his voice. So when Moses finally looked at them one night and said, "It's time," they didn't ask why. They just nodded. The betrayal had burned through them like fire, but the idea that revenge could be real, that soaked in slow like the sweat on their backs. They had all lost something. Cato lost his future. Elijah lost his faith. Moses lost the last piece of himself that could be tamed. It wasn't just the hangings or the lashings or the lies. It was the silence, the way their pain didn't matter, the way Abram's death was erased before his body hit the ground. The deal was never real, but the rage it left behind, that was. So they built something else in its place. Not hope, not freedom. A plan. It started with a map scratched under the floorboards, shift schedules memorized, guard changes timed, stolen tools hidden behind barrels, sugar sacks stitched with blades and trust, rebuilt one glance at a time. They never said kill. They said balance. They didn't talk about what they'd do to Rutledge and the others. They talked about what would happen after. Would they stay? Would they run? Would they survive? Or would they just matter? Every night they met behind the chapel ruins, where no one dared go. They practiced in silence, striking at trees with dull machetes, wrestling until bruises formed, until the pain meant nothing. They didn't fantasize about vengeance. They prepared for it. And all the while, the overseers laughed, drank, slept easy. Rutledge never suspected the boy he'd chained would be the same one to sharpen the blade. He forgot that when you promise a man freedom and give him chains, you're not killing his spirit. You're giving it a name, and that name was Moses. But this was only the beginning. The cane had not yet been stained. The pouch had not yet fallen in the dirt. And 4 white men still thought they ruled Cyprus. They had no idea the countdown had already started. The deal was broken. Now something else was being built, something far more dangerous than rebellion, something personal. The days before the bloodbath were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but like a held breath. Cypress Quarters moved like it always did. Sun up, sun down, fields picked, backs bent. But something had changed. The laughter from the overseers felt thinner. The glances between slaves lasted a little too long. The wind carried secrets. Moses no longer carved notches into his board. He didn't need to. Everything was memorized. They knew when Rutledge would drink himself unconscious. Friday nights. They knew the dogs were locked up by 10 p.m. After Lila, the cook, slipped crushed berries into their stew. They knew Cato could still swing an axe, even with mangled fingers. They knew Elijah didn't hesitate anymore. It was all timed, every movement, every kill. They had even chosen the weather, a moonless night. Clouds thick enough to swallow sound, humidity so heavy, even the insects went silent. The plan wasn't shouted, it was passed in whispers, one sentence at a time. A look, a nod, a hand on a shoulder. 12 people, each with a role. Ruth, who cleaned the overseer's boots, had stolen their room keys. Lila, with her steady hands, had loosened the hinges on the weapon's chest. 2 teenagers, Micah and Josie, mapped escape, routes through the piney woods. And then there was Moses. He didn't talk about what would happen if they failed, because failure wasn't an option. Each night leading up to it, he prayed alone. Not to be spared, but to be clear-minded when the time came. They weren't warriors. They were survivors, shaped by years of silence and sorrow. But now, they had direction, and vengeance is a teacher with sharp teeth. They practiced how to strike silently, how to hold a man down until the blade did its job, how to kill in one move. They whispered names, not just of the living, but of the dead. Abram, Henry, the girl Ruth had buried after Rutledge's visit. The boy who vanished after screaming one night in the sugar shed. They weren't just killing overseers, they were answering ghosts. The final night felt different. Everything was ready. No mistakes, no second chances. Imagine it. You're standing in the cane fields at midnight. Sweat sticks to your spine. The wind has stopped. Even the frogs have gone quiet. You know in 10 minutes you'll be holding a knife. Not for survival, but for justice. Your breath is slow. Your heart isn't racing, it's steady. You look at your brothers, at the woman who raised you, at the boy who stitched his sister's name into his sleeve, and you nod. This wasn't about the North, or the Union Army, or emancipation. This wasn't about freedom papers or politics or flags. This was about Cyprus, about what had been done here and what would never be allowed again. A final prayer was spoken. No words, just silence, heads bowed, no mercy, no hesitation, no fear. The first target was Rutledge. The others would follow, all four. 4 men who thought they'd never bleed. 4 men who didn't check the locks anymore. 4 men who thought the whip was the only language their workers understood. They were wrong. The cane fields don't forget, and neither do the people forced to harvest them. What would you do if the only justice left in the world had to come from your own hands? Could you slice the throat of the man who stole your family? Could you listen to his breath choke out through a wound you gave him? Could you walk away and never look back? Midnight was coming. The blades were sharpened, the ghosts were watching, and Cypress Quarters would never sleep the same again. It began with breath. 12 of them, held all at once. The cane swayed ever so slightly in the warm August night, whispering secrets to those who knew how to listen. The sky was black. No stars. No moon. Just a suffocating darkness and the weight of something irreversible. Inside the bunkhouse, Overseer Rutledge lay drunk in his cot, boots still on, one hand curled around a half-empty bottle. The lantern beside him flickered, then dimmed, then died. Moses was first through the door. The blade didn't hesitate. It slid across Rutledge's throat like butter, deep and fast. The sound wasn't a scream. It was a gasp. Like the air was trying to escape his body before the blood did. He never opened his eyes. Elijah was next. He moved to the adjacent room, where 2 overseers were still awake, playing cards, laughing over bad hands and better whiskey. One looked up just in time to see the butt of a hammer flying toward his skull. The crack echoed like a pistol shot. The second tried to stand. Lila was waiting by the door. She shoved a broken bottle into his gut with such force it disappeared halfway, before he hit the floor, twitching. Outside, Cato and Ruth moved swiftly through the sleeping quarters. The 4th overseer was wide awake. He'd heard something. He stumbled into the corridor, belt in hand, pistol at his hip. He never got to use either. Cato's axe struck first, a clean blow to the stomach, splitting flesh from bone. The overseer dropped to his knees, blood pouring through his fingers. Ruth stepped forward, eyes steady, and drove a fireplace poker straight into his eye socket. He screamed. This one screamed. It didn't matter. No one came to help him. The dogs were already dead, poisoned 2 nights earlier. The gun room had been emptied, locks removed, keys stolen, every variable accounted for. 12 people, 12 movements, no room for error, and in less than 10 minutes, the overseers of Cypress Quarters were no more. 4 men, gutted in the night. Each death personalized. Each act carried out not in rage, but in control. This wasn't chaos, it was ritual. By the time the bell in the sugar mill rang out by accident, knocked in the struggle, it was already too late. The rebels had disappeared into the woods, gone. No footprints, no trail, just blood. The only thing left behind was a brown leather pouch, dropped deliberately at the edge of the cane. The initials MS carved into the flap. They could have torched the house. They could have taken more, but they didn't. Because this wasn't about destruction, it was about message, precision, balance. The cane fields were silent again, but they weren't the same. Imagine walking those rows in the morning, boots crunching dried blood into the dirt. Imagine seeing the bodies, limbs twisted, eyes wide, and knowing this didn't come from war or bandits or the North. It came from within, from the people you thought had no voice, from the very hands you beat, bought and branded, the hands that built your wealth, and now had torn it apart. Somewhere deep in the trees, the 12 regrouped. No celebration, no smiles, only quiet. They had done what they came to do, not for freedom, not for glory, but for the dead, for Abram, for Henry, for the girls who vanished in the night and were never spoken of again. They walked barefoot, blood on their clothes, breathing in the pine, waiting for the next move. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Their message was carved into flesh, into history, into the cane that would never grow quite the same again. By morning, Cypress would be on fire, not from flames, but from fear. Because what the overseers had always believed, that control could never be broken, had died in the dirt with them. And the only thing scarier than a slave with a dream is a slave with a plan. At dawn, Cypress Quarters smelled like metal and mud, the kind of smell that doesn't wash off. The first to find the bodies was a house servant sent to fetch the overseers for morning roll call. She didn't scream. She just dropped the bucket and walked away, barefoot, silent. Word spread like a fever. Pinkerton men arrived 3 days later, hired guns, impressed coats, notebooks in hand, asking questions nobody wanted to answer. The masters wanted to believe it was a northern plot, that the Union Army had slipped saboteurs past the front lines to stir rebellion. But the evidence told another story. No doors had been forced open. No tracks led into the property, only a way. Every strike was surgical, every exit timed, every death deliberate. And that pouch, the one with MS carved into it, it was still there, still soaked in blood, still whispering one name to those who knew how to read it. Moses. They never found him, or the others. They vanished into the pine, swallowed by a land they knew better than any map. Some said they made it to a Union line. Others said they disappeared into the swamps, building new lives in hidden colonies where no whip dared follow. But Cypress never recovered. The overseers were replaced, but none stayed long. The cane crop wilted the next season. One field caught fire without warning. Another flooded during a drought. Strange accidents, sudden storms, livestock that refused to enter the killing fields. Superstition spread. Some said you could hear the cries at night, not of the murdered, but of the men who died with blood on their hands and guilt in their throats. Mothers told their children, never walk the cane alone, never carry a blade unless you mean to use it, and never, ever speak the names of the dead without closing your eyes. Because this land remembered. The church wouldn't acknowledge it. The newspapers printed half-truths. Unexplained killings at Cypress. Slave saboteurs suspected. No, one called it justice. No one dared call it a revolt, but everyone knew. And among the slaves on nearby plantations, a story began to spread. Not loudly, not in the open, but in songs, in whispers, in lullabies sung to newborns by candlelight. They came at midnight, knives in hand. The cane drank deep. The blood turned sand. No chains remain. No master stands. They carved our names with their own hands. No names were ever added to the record. No memorials. No gravestones. Just that leather pouch. And a legacy too dangerous for history to keep. Imagine knowing your ancestors didn't just suffer. They fought. They planned. They struck back. And they won, not on a battlefield, not with armies, but in the night, in the shadows, with nothing but rage, silence, and steel. That kind of story doesn't make it into textbooks, but it survives. It moves like wind through the cane. It hums in the walls of old plantation homes. It lives because Cypress Quarters wasn't the only place where blood turned the tide. It was just one of the few that dared to leave a mark. Stories like this must never be forgotten, not because they're comfortable, but because they're true. And truth, especially the kind they tried to bury, always has a way of cutting its way back to the surface. So if you're still here, still listening, know this. The blood may have dried, but the story hasn't, and more are waiting to be told.